Shalom and welcome to Rodeph Emet, Pursuer of Truth. This is Bracha about Yosef, and I'm here today with Joseph Atwill, who is a literary analyst who wrote the book Caesar's Messiah, and John Hudson, who is a Shakespearean scholar. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Would you like to tell us what you've been working on?
Well, yes, I'd be happy to. Joe and I, in fact, have been working together since 2002, we were just saying, when we began working together on some aspects of the Gospels. And up to that point, the Gospels had really been regarded as works of history, and people had assumed that the figure of Jesus was a real historical figure. But there was a small minority of scholars who had argued that Jesus was actually simply a literary character, and that the Gospels were actually works of fiction. They were works of literature. And my own interest had been particularly in how the Gospel of Matthew had been created as work of literature. And it was at that point that I met Joe, and he brought in his work, Caesar's Messiah, a unique understanding of typology that showed not just how these things had been created as works of literature, but why they were written and who had done it. So perhaps, Joe, you could talk about
Sure.
the typology aspect.
The Gospels are, in fact, a genre of fiction, which I refer to as typologic fiction. They are very easy to understand if you can begin the Gospels with understanding the Matthew birth narrative. In that narrative, Jesus is being linked to Moses. This is not something that is particularly controversial. Everyone knows that that Jesus goes down to Egypt. Joseph goes down to Egypt in Exodus, and this is also the beginning of the story of Jesus in the Gospels. So the author of Matthew is linking the Savior of Israel, Jesus, to the prior Savior, Moses. In fact, the entire structure of the Gospels from Matthew on is regarding another individual. So it seems as though you're writing about Jesus, but in fact the authors are actually foreseeing another individual. And
that's the typology.
And that's the typology. And this is a genre of literature that is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the authors of the Gospels, in fact, are mocking that Jewish typology that they use to look for the Messiah with. But the question, of course, is Gospels.
Yes. Well,
how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, why, in fact, why are they called Gospels? Because the word Evangelion in Greek means good news of military victory. And, why should anybody at the end of the Roman-Jewish War, around after the year 70, why would anybody have created something called good news of military victory? What military victory could they possibly have been talking about? Well, the only military victories in question are, of course, the Jewish losses to the Romans, because the Romans were the victors. And there is no reason why the Jews would have created such documents and called them good news of military victory. The only people who would have created such documents were, in fact, the Romans. Right. And that really is your unique insight into the Gospel's use of peculiar typology related to the Romans.
And the fact is that the victors write history. And Jesus' prophecies are all regarding military victories of the Flavian Caesars. Fishing for men at the Sea of Galilee, encircling Jerusalem with a wall, raising the temple, laying low the Galilean towns. These prophecies that Jesus makes all uniquely envision the victories of a particular set of Caesars. So,
talking about the Flavian Caesars.
The Flavian Caesars. So this is the first group, I think, that should be considered having produced Gospels. So now, to move forward, the Gospels had been produced and have had their influence on us throughout history. But as it turns out, Caesar's Messiah was not the first book that had ever been written describing or linking to, explaining the typology in the Gospels, the typology that foresees these Flavian Caesars, specifically in the Gospels, Titus Flavius, who was the individual who did raise the temple and actually fulfilled Jesus' prophecies. So Jesus' ministry is working on two levels. All of the prophecies are about Titus, the direct prophecies, but all of his actions are typologic prophecies. So it was with some interest that several years ago I was reading Titus Andronicus, and I was interested in Titus Andronicus because
that's the Shakespearean
play Titus Andronicus, because Andronicus is the name of an individual that sacked the temple, and of course so is Titus.
What was his position?
Andronicus?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. He was like a general with I forget what exactly.
He was a member of the Andronikites.
But I knew that I knew in my mind somehow that he had been a sacker of the temple. I didn't really know much about the individual, but I was curious as to whether or not Shakespeare was using metaphors or symbolism that might somehow be linking to Titus Flavius. And so when I read the play, it was almost immediately clear that the author was linking to the symbolism in the gospel based upon this typology. It was quite clear. And so I started reading other Shakespearean plays and was able to essentially have an impression that this was literature that had been written in response to the Gospels. I focused on a particular individual named Amelia Bassano, though I wasn't sure if she had written all of the literature, which I still actually am not completely convinced. Though I know she wrote many of the plays.
Much of it.
But it was not clear to me. So my colleague, John Hudson, happens to be an expert in Shakespearean literature.
Okay.
And John and I met, and it was then that we were able, through his expertise, to really start to begin the understanding of the context of the Shakespearean literature.
Well, I mean, just come back to a little tiny bit. I think your work on Titus Andronicus, when you first told me about it, was, gosh, could that possibly be true? And then I thought, well, yes, it is, because not only is the German version called Titus and Vespasiani, which is Titus and his father Vespasian, but there's also this very strange character who has these 85 lines about fly killing added in.
Which were the Maccabees?
No, the fly killing lines were added into the 1594 quarto, and they relate to a description of the third Flavian Caesar, Domitian Caesar, who in the biography by Suetonius is described as having his favorite hobby as killing flies.
Oh,
so that was really, for me, the key thing that showed Joe that you were really right, and that there were these three clear indications of the Caesars here. But coming back to the Bassano family, yes, I mean, Amelia Bassano is not very well known, but her full name is Amelia Bassano Lanier, and her dates are 1569 to 1645, and she was the first woman in England to publish a book of original poetry, and she was also the mistress to the man in charge of the English theatre, Lord Hunsdon. So one would have thought that somebody would have, before Joe, would have suspected that she might have been the author, but they just hadn't. So when we began looking at this, I went into understanding that the position that she was living in England as a member of the Bassano family, who were court musicians. They were Murano Jews, originally from Venice, and they had a certain degree of protection because they were court musicians. But she wrote the plays using the same sort of traditional literary devices that Muranos in Spain and in Italy had used previously, in order to conceal the nature of what she was doing. Because obviously, if she had written directly about what she was doing, she would have been killed, as in fact Christopher Marlowe was. So she was in this unique position of living as a Jew in a Christian world, and being associated with the court as the mistress to one of the most powerful men at court. and having unique insight not into the theatre industry, but also into music, which is so very important in the plays. So it was this background that she brought to not just Titus Andronicus, but also to Romeo and Juliet and to the other plays.
Right, and she wrote a play under her name called Salve Deus. A long poem.
1,600-line poem.
Which was the first poem that was, as John mentioned, that actually was published, that a woman had written
That's
in
the only
Britain.
way I would know her name.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
That's right.
in the play, in her
Salve
poem,
Deus.
she links to the Shakespearean literature. She has a number of puns on the word will, which can be decoded once the symbolism is actually between her poem and the Shakespearean literature. Once the correct interpretive framework is understood, then the nature of her symbolism makes all of this clear.
Yeah.
And so,
and it's quite clear because she uses word dictina, or which is only otherwise used as dictima in Love's Labour's Lost.
Right.
She talks about a little masque with the descent of a chariot of Juno, which is just like in the Tempest. And there are lots of verbal similarities. She talks about frost affecting the tops of plants. Yeah. So there's so in addition to the typology, there is good literary evidence as well.
Absolutely, and the reason that I think she hasn't been much more of a focus is simply because she's a woman.
Absolutely,
I think
black, and of colour,
and a dark-skinned woman. All of the symbolism of the Shakespearean plays, which has just completely baffled scholars. There are so many what are referred to as puzzle passages that they simply cannot make any sense of, are now able to be explained completely clearly. Everyone will be able to finally understand what the Shakespearean was about. Just as an example, Titus Andronicus. If you read through the play, you'll see that Titus ends up making the Gentile noble family eat human flesh. He fools them into it. Well, this is exactly what the Gospels do to the Jewish royal family.
Right.
Titus Flavius had created literature which shows the Jews being unwittingly led into eating of human flesh, and the Romans built an entire satire upon that literary device that they created. Well, Amelia Bassano, who I just want to mention, is an obvious candidate for the Shakespearean literature because she's one of the very few people in the country that could speak Italian. Her family came from the area that the Shakespearean Italian plays are about.
And she would have known Hebrew.
She knew Hebrew, which explains how she was able to have the Hebrew. And she was a language instructor, tutor. So, of course, Latin and French would have been naturally languages that she spoke. And she was a native English speaker, having been born in England. So that unique environment, coupled with her genius, was the basis of this incredible vocabulary that the Shakespearean author had. So anyway...
And this is beginning to be accepted because the Shakespearean Authorship Trust has now accepted that this interpretive framework is one of the top sort of seven or eight frameworks.
So there are only 8 frameworks.
There have been 66 different authorship candidates put forward, but most of them are really completely ridiculous. Some of them about people who didn't even exist. So there are only now 8 frameworks that have been accepted by the Shakespearean Authorship Trust.
So this is the most coherent one so far.
By far. In other words, we're the only one, and I mean, people can have whatever opinion about the statement they want, but it is the case that we are able to explain the puzzle passages. It's as with the Gospels. I mean, why does Jesus say, "Eat of my flesh"? Yeah. It makes no sense. It's a blaspheme from the Hebraic perspective. But once you have the correct interpretive framework, the Gospels actually become very, very clear and understandable.
But it's also
the Shakespearean literature is the same.
It's the same for the Shakespearean literature, but it's also important that that in the 17th century, when the author of these plays was writing, I mean, biblical interpretation was very common. People were giving long 2-hour biblical interpretation sermons, like on every street corner. The interest in the Roman-Jewish War was very common. I did an analysis which showed that like almost every month there was something was being published on the Roman-Jewish War, And the plays are remarkable because they have these 3,000 biblical passages, and they use 14 different biblical translations.
Right.
And and Emilia Bassano was brought up from the age of 7 in the Willoughby household, which was heavily linked into a number of Bible translators such as Coverdale and Tyndale. So she came out of an environment that was very sensitive to Bible translation, and it is that really that enabled her to create turn these 3,000 references into this incredibly complicated typology that Joe is describing.
That's right, exactly. And this is why only you need this combination of sort of the literary analysis coupled with Shakespearean scholarship to make any progress. We're talking about a very complicated body of literature, but it has now been decoded, and I am very confident that within a short period of time we will transcend and get rid of the other interpretive frameworks, because we can explain everything, whereas others simply cannot.
Well, what's more, we can actually translate it on stage and show how it actually works on stage.
Well, I think it's an incredible discovery. People don't understand typology as a science. They understand archaeology to decipher historical things, coins, and things like that, but they don't understand typology per se, and
they don't understand it as a language. They don't understand that it is very easy to create a type. You can talk about someone obliquely by creating someone that represents that individual. You can give them a different name, a different location, but as long as you have enough parallels to that someone who is aware of the typological system can link to, you can communicate information. And this is what the Gospels are. The Gospels attempt to communicate information from Caesars concerning their power, their struggle with the Jews, and how they created a religion to control them, and also to control all of their subjects. The Shakespearean literature is a reaction to that, but it builds on the same principles.
Uses the same typology.
And it's very witty in that she knew that eventually the Gospels would be widely understood, but she wanted for there to be a response from a Jew to the Roman sort of pie in the face that the Gospels represent. And that's really what the Shakespearean literature is. That's why, for example, in Romeo and Juliet, you get to, through this bizarre plot, to a tomb scene at the end, which should right off the bat be understood as being linked to the Gospels, because they're using the Feast of Lamastad, which is the Gentile version of the consecrated bread. So it's obviously relating to the Jewish Passover. And all of the numbers in Romeo and Juliet are Daniel. They're all based on 7, or the midpoint 11. So you can see the number 42 or 11 will come up during the course of the play, because just like in the Gospels you have the countdown of the Passover, here you're having the countdown of Lamastad in a backdrop of Daniel's prophecies.
The big thing is that they were, you were saying that earlier, that they changed the situation from devouring the flesh of Jews to devour.
Exactly, and so now you end up, just as you do in Titus Andronicus, and in fact just as you do in all of the plays, with the Gentiles cannibalizing themselves, as opposed to the Gospels, which has the Jews doing it. You see, this is the wit that Emilia Bassano possessed to reverse the wicked humor that the Romans had, and the curse that they placed upon the Jews, because it wasn't just humor. They were literally cursing the Jews with their...
It was blasphemous.
They were creating anti-Semitism.
They deliberately created anti-Semitism, because Vespasian and Titus both received wounds during the war. A historian recorded that Titus never regained the use of his left arm, and Vespasian almost bled to death. And so when you stab a Caesar, you can expect retribution. Well, and these people who are total nihilists, cared about nothing. They created a religion that embodied anti-Semitism just for their own revenge.
And I think we both agree that Emilia Bassano was really writing these plays as Jewish revenge literature against the Romans.
That's right.
They reversed what the Romans had done in various ways. In some cases the cannibalism, in some cases the other places. But in every case they were taking revenge, specifically on Vespasian and on Titus, and to some extent also on Domitian.
That's right. They're using exactly. And she's simply using the royal family in the plays as representatives of the Flavians, so that she can continue her revenge against them.
But I'd like to talk a little bit about Dream, because as an example, because it's a very wonderful example, and because we've actually we staged it last year here at the Abingdon, and Joe was here. Was fortunately
historic moment.
Yeah, watch it happen. And the character of Titania, who is the fairy queen, is an allegory or typological figure for Titus Caesar, and the character of Oberon, who is the king, who is a jealous and invisible and addressed as a lord, and has just come from India. Well, India was like a synonym for Judea. So you have Oberon, king of Judea, and his lines in many cases come from the solar psalms. And he's fighting a war with Titus Titania. What war would that be? Well, it's clearly if it's set in the first century, it's the Roman-Jewish war, and he's fighting a war about a little Indian boy or a little Judean boy whose mother is a virgin votress and who is crowned with thorny flowers, and who has been stolen away from Oberon and the Jews by Titus. Well, you can guess what this is. This is transparent. This is the way that the Romans did indeed steal away the figure of the Messiah from the Jews in the first century and turn it into the literary figure of Jesus. And then the play goes on because very wonderful work by Patricia Parker, who is the editor of the New Arden edition and professor of English at Stanford, has shown that the character of the wall is actually the wall that divides heaven and earth and that comes down on the day of Apocalypse, and that the character Bottom, who plays Pyramus, is a representation of Jesus, and that Thisbe is a representation of the church, and this comes out of medieval allegory. So what actually happens with the mechanicals put on their little play is it is the apocalypse, the wall or partition comes down between heaven and earth, and that Pyramus and Thisbe, Jesus and the church, can come together again, except, of course, they all die, and Peter Quince, who is an allegory for St. Peter, presides over this collapse of Christianity. And then what happens? Everybody comes out of the graves, and they dance around, and Oberon distributes dew. And it's the apocalypse, and if you look at every Christian apocalypse I've looked at, it doesn't have dew being distributed. But if you look at the Zohar, and if you look at the Pirkei of Rabbi Eliezer, you will see the apocalypse is associated with dew.
Right, so, and I just want to interrupt one thing. The character of Peter, people may be confused, well, why would they be using Peter? Because, in fact, the Apostle Peter is a type for the Peter, or the Simon, who was the rebel leader. There was two rebel leaders, Simon and John, who were part of the Messianic movement that Titus fought against. And the character of Simon was the historical individual was transformed viciously into the lampoon character of Simon or Peter in the Gospels, so that at the end of the Gospels in John 21, Simon is told he's going to be taken where he doesn't want to go and given to death to glorify God. And this, in fact, happens, to the historical Simon, who is captured by Titus and taken to Rome, whereas his cohort, John, is spared. You see, so this is an example of a fulfillment of the prophecy that anyone can do. Anyone listening to this can simply go to John 21 and then compare it against the history of the Jewish war that Josephus wrote. You can see the absolutely transparent but very complex parallel that occurs, and you will find nowhere in any scholarship the linkage between this simple event. Just as if you wish to go to Titus Andronicus and look at the passage which describes the brother of Titus, who was a killer of flies, and read Suetonius's description of Domitian, who is Titus's brother, it will just stand right out that his bizarre characterization of killing flies, and he's Titus's brother. Now, this is obvious symbolism, and yet it has not been plumbed. So,
that's a great example, Joe, of how the use of typology that we began by talking about, that is used in the Gospels, is actually used by the author of the Shakespearean plays. And I think the actual Hudson discovery, as we we call it.
The Atwill Hudson Discovery. Yeah,
That's what it's been called.
Yeah, that's what it's been called.
Yeah.
Offers really a consistent interpretive framework now for the first time, not just for the Gospels, but also for the Shakespearean plays.
We are very, we want to make sure that it is referred to as the Atwill Hudson Discovery, and that we maintain that with it we have a 100% capacity of explanatory power. In other words, we can explain finally all the Shakespearean plays. And anyone who listens to this, I would hope that they will, if they're in New York, would attend any of the productions that John is putting on, because he puts
the Dark Lady Players.
Right,
I'm going to have you on another show.
Yes.
And if you go to the Dark Lady Players website, you'll be able to find when these performances are come on, and you'll be able to actually see finally the Shakespearean plays performed as Jewish revenge literature.
Yes.
Well,
they will finally make sense. All of these individuals people who sit through Shakespearean plays and they make no sense, and you wonder why are we here. The play is just
and
we can't
funny.
Right. The fact is they are brilliantly comic. And all of the characters will spring to life. Suddenly, you'll really be engaged with the play, and it's a fascinating experience. So,
and we are currently working on As You Like It. But I mean, the works that we have got now, we have two major books. We have the biography, and we have the
and we have the biography, and we have a book of technical analysis of the plays. So there's in the short. Very quickly, we should have two works out. One is a fascinating biography of Amelia Bassano Lanier, and I just very briefly wanted to say that she was engaged in perhaps the most interesting and important love affair in history. She had an affair with Christopher Marlowe, who was not Jewish, but had come to the understanding of the Gospels that they had been produced by the Flavian Caesars. And there is a letter in existence which maintains that Marlowe had written a book which shows that the Gospels were all the work of a man.
All of one man's making.
Right, all of one man's making. And he was killed by the state immediately after that. This was the real reason that Marlowe was assassinated. At the point that he was executed by the state, Amelia Bassano Lanier, I'm not sure, was she Lanier at that point? No, she wasn't. She wasn't married. This was after that. But she then took up Marlowe's desire to make this information public, but she took a different approach to it that Marlowe
she wrote it into the...
She put it in code because she had seen what happened to Marlowe after he had attempted
to
write. I wrote in. John, I was just before we got on. I was explaining to John that I'd written this line and that I hadn't shown him yet about that Marlowe had written the first version of Caesar's Messiah, except it would have been much better written than the one that I produced.
But you're right. It was we know we know from looking at his plays that what he was doing.
Marlowe had understood. He understood it. But Amelia took the plays into a completely different direction. She formed them into Jewish revenge literature, and she didn't try to directly inform the public. She wanted when the Gospels were finally understood by the public, that there would immediately at that time an understanding of the Shakespearean literature would be the counterbalance to the fact that the Gospels were Roman comedies.
And I think really in sort of summary, the Atwill Hudson work creates the basis for a wonderful film of this greatest love story in history. We have major books. We have a series of productions of Shakespearean plays, and I think we are in the early stage discussions of taking this out now to the public, and I think it's going to be an interesting time.
Life should be a tremendous. It's a tremendous biography. And you just make one terrific movie because it was just an incredible period. The King James Bible was being written. There were Marrano Jews that were hiding from their religion. The Elizabethan reign of terror was trying to stamp out the Catholics.
Jews were literally screaming from the grave with their literature, and I know there's
Exactly
plenty
right.
of literature that shows that.
And she was writing in the tradition of the many Marranos who had created the literature in response to the Inquisition, and she was using the same devices, and now it's all becoming public.
Yeah, finally.
So, thank you so much.
I'm delighted that we're able to get this information out. I really believe that if we looked even further, we could see other literature that has the same type of typological theme. So
that's correct, and but we think that currently we should just focus with the Gospels and Shakespeare because it's too disorienting to try to
this is more than enough.
This is more than enough. We're focused.
This is so visual.
Yeah.
I'm going to continue on with Joseph Atwill, and you have another meeting to go to. The last time we spoke, we talked about the fact that even though the Flavian Caesars created the Gospels, there had to be some intermediary steps before that. They didn't just all of a sudden decide to create the Gospels. Can you go into some detail about, first of all, the war between the Romans and the Jews, and what exactly happened? Was there any literature indicating that this was happening? What was going on at the time?
Well, the Maccabees had established a religious state in, I believe, 167 BCE.
Okay.
This lasted for over 100 years, but at a certain point, the family of Herod somehow interjected itself into the Maccabean authority. And a civil war broke out between two members of the Maccabees. The Herods sided with one of them and invited Pompey to come in and essentially end the war. From that point forward, the Maccabees were never in complete control of Israel. The family that was in charge, the Herods, were clearly puppets of Rome. The family had a lot of connections to the Flavians.
We're talking about the Sadducean Jews, are we?
Well, I don't really use those terms. Those terms come from the Gospels, and I simply don't trust those terms. I think a better dividing line is simply religious Jews and Jews that were working for Rome. That is the dividing line of Judaism that I think was really in play in this era.
Okay.
And the Herods attempted to become Jewish. They took Maccabean princesses and married them so that their children could then be seen as in the Maccabean lineage. But the fact is, the Herods were very connected to the family of Caesars, the Flavians, as were the Alexanders. Now, Philo Alexander is one of the most famous, purportedly Jewish philosophers in history, and he practiced and philosophized a sort of what's called a Hellenized version of Judaism. Clearly, it was something that could connect to the Roman Empire. But this wasn't the version of Judaism that you read about in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was a very xenophobic and militaristic and nationalistic kind of religion. So I think that the family of Alexander and the Herods were essentially efforts by Rome, or were working with Rome, to try to transform Judaism into a version of Judaism that could live with Rome's authority.
Are you talking about a more pacifistic version?
Yes, certainly one that wouldn't rebel. What they were hoping to do was to essentially take Jewish scripture and interpret it in such a way that the Messianic movement would not rebel against Rome. And I wanted just to talk for a second about the connections between the Alexanders and the Herods and the Flavians. Philo's brother was the head of Alexandria, which was the wealthiest city in Rome. He was the Albrach, which is the ruler of Alexandria. And so he had a lot of financial connections to the Roman Empire. his son was Tiberius Alexander. So Tiberius Alexander is the nephew of Philo. Tiberius Alexander is the general of the Flavian army that is attacking Jerusalem.
I see.
So in other words, he is so connected to the Flavians that he actually put him in charge of the army, even though he is a Jew and has these connections to Jewish scholarship. His brother had married Bernice, who was a Herod, who ended up being the mistress of Titus. So you can see these families are so closely interrelated. And they all have a problem, which is that there is a movement, a messianic movement in Judea that will not accept Roman rule. So when you look at the Gospels, in order to have produced that literature, you needed a tremendous understanding of Jewish scripture. This is where it comes from. It comes from the Jews that had these financial relationships with the Caesars, were making a lot of money on the relationship, and were secular. They obviously did not ascribe to the theologic vision that the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls did. So the Roman Empire, the Roman effort to control Judaism goes all the way back to Julius Caesar, who appointed the high priests. So at the very onset of the Roman control of Judea, they tried to interject Rome into the Jewish religion so that the authority structure would be pro-Roman, and then they could thereby keep the country pacified and keep it as a tax-producing region.
I see. Well, I find this all, very interesting, but, no one has actually seen that before until your book, Caesar's Messiah. They saw a more pro-Roman perspective in the literature, but nobody really knew where that came from.
Right. The symbolism in the Gospels has simply been misunderstood. It's incredible, but it just has not been grasped, even though it's fairly straightforward.
So we do know that the Gospels are really fiction, a fictionalized satire.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's not really history. And up
Absolutely
until
not.
now, it's been accepted as
yeah,
history.
And that's why it hasn't been understood. People look at it as either religious literature or as having a basis in history, and they attempt to understand it through those frameworks. This gets you nowhere. If you want to understand the Gospels, you have to first, as I had mentioned in our prior show, understand the typology that the authors are using, which is visible in the very first page. Simply follow the story of Jesus up until his 40 days in the wilderness and compare them to the experience that Moses had. In Genesis and Exodus, you'll see Joseph goes down to Egypt. There's a massacre of the innocents. They take the same sentence. Those are dead who sought your life. And what you're having is the parallel events are occurring in a very specific sequence. The sequence of events in Genesis and Exodus are occurring in Matthew. So you can walk through until you get to the three temptations of Jesus in these 40 days in the wilderness are obviously a representation of the 40 years in the wilderness and the temptation of God by the Israelites. So there's no question, scholars are not confused by this. You can see that there is this very precise genre of typology that the authors are using. So now when you come to the very next line in the gospel, which is Jesus's gathering of his disciples at the Sea of Galilee, and he says, if you follow me, you'll become fishers of men. It's not a stretch to try to look at this passage as perhaps having the same structural basis as the ones that just led up to it, which is typology. And of course now it links directly to Titus, who in fact fished for men, his followers fished for men at the Sea of Galilee. And then once you link up the two campaigns between Jesus' ministry and Titus's campaign, the events just make perfect sense as you move forward.
Well, what is it exactly that people like Dr. Avalos missed? That he's a biblical scholar, is he not?
Yep.
So what is it that biblical scholars are missing? What do they need to look for?
Well, it's interesting. I think it's just in the debates that I've had, obviously some scholars do support the work at this point, but for example, Robert Price wrote a completely negative review of Caesar's Messiah, and it's interesting. It's on the web. You can go and read it. And it's quite amazing in that he doesn't sort of negate the scholarship. He simply says that these events are not related, because Atwill has a case of parallel mania. And what's fascinating about this particular charge is that it is literally the reverse of what is true, because when I say that, well, parallel mania, or trying to see information that doesn't exist between parallels, is because the parallels are too vague or they have no context. In other words, they're so, one person in a million might see this, therefore it's a very weak parallel, or that the context just makes it impossible that the writers would have been describing the same thing. The fact is that the Roman humor uses the literal parallel. In other words, when Jesus says, if you follow me, you will become a fisher of men, the event it links to is literally fishing for men. So you see, you can make certain criticisms of the parallel, but one that you can't make is parallel mania, because it is not.
It's a literal.
Right. In other words, I'm using the literal interpretation of the words. When I say that that when Jesus says, "Eat of my flesh," he is foreseeing an event in the coming war, which occurs 40 years in the future. So when they date his ministry, regarding cannibalism of a Messiah, I am focusing on the literal interpretation of the words and taking an event which has the literal activity. The scholars who are attacking the thesis, they're the ones who have these metaphorical interpretations. So the parallel mania charge is, frankly, just incoherent.
Well, what is it that Jewish scholars need to be looking for? You see, in Judaism, since the destruction of the temple, the table has replaced the altar.
Right.
And so we can understand somebody saying, having symbolic dinner.
Sure.
So that's an understandable thing, and that might be a Jewish thing to do.
It could be. But I think that the idea of, well, first of all, I mean, just from a theological perspective, the idea of a Christ who is crucified is unlikely, because that individual would not have had the power of David. But in that era, the Messiah that they were looking for was an individual who had the power of David. In other words, he was the son of David, who had been the anointed one, who had a connection to God. He wouldn't have been captured by the Romans and crucified. So the story is a little, weird just on its face, but the way that Jewish scholars will be able to make progress there's only one way that anyone can understand the Gospels, and that is you have to start on page 1 and understand the typologic system that is used to link Jesus to Moses. And then you have to try to, with that understanding, look at the Gospels with fresh eyes and see if in fact the ministry is linked to someone else. And that's when the individual that Jesus is prophesizing, the Son of Man, who in fact did raise the temple, did encircle Jerusalem with the wall, and did lay low the Galilean towns, suddenly this individual pops out. Because remember, we're not just dealing with typologic prophecies, which are it's more complicated. We're dealing with literal prophecies. There's only one individual in history that could be the Son of Man that Jesus envisioned. See, the Gospels are actually a little puzzle. And the puzzle is simply, who is the Son of Man that Jesus is envisioning? The Christian scholars, and I think the Jewish scholars, have always accepted that it's Jesus himself. He's predicting that he will return, the coming of the Christ. Everyone is looking for this. Well, the fact is, that's not really what the authors were talking about. They were talking about the literal individual who would encircle Jerusalem with the wall, raise the temple, and lay low the Galilean towns. It's Titus. As soon as you take this perspective and start to do scholarship, Titus just pops right out of the Gospels. And it's interesting, it wouldn't surprise me if it's Jewish scholars that really break the Caesar's Messiah thesis into the public domain, because the historians, it's such a change in their paradigm that they tend to defend it, because they're defending their own, perspective. But I am hopeful that the book is being reviewed by Jewish scholars as we speak, and I think that some courageous individuals are going to step forward, and we'll start to see news stories about it, and once that happens, it'll very quickly become sort of the widely held paradigm of understanding of the Gospels and the origins of Christianity, because it's simply not that difficult.
What I'm trying to do is get Jewish scholars interested in the study of the roots of anti-Semitism. And I believe that this is really where it really originated.
Sure.
And I also think that, as we talked about before, that there were Jews who were screaming from the grave, trying to get this information out.
Sure.
And they never were heard because nobody understood what they were saying.
Right. Well, the Catholic Church had a strict policy regarding this sort of information being made public.
I mean, people were murdered because they were trying to get this information out.
Right.
When people were found out, they were mysteriously disappeared.
Right. Right. I mean, the most classic example of Marlowe, because there is literature, in fact, stating he had written a book that was, making it clear the Gospels were written by a single man and not by God. When you have a letter like that describing the actual book that Marlowe wrote, and then look at his plays and understand how they are representing the Gospels, Jesus-Titus typology, then you know what happened. The state just crushed him. They killed him. So that was, and he, remember, had been highly regarded by the court and by the church. He was actually being groomed to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was a brilliant young man. So the Jewish scholars of the Middle Ages, and a number of them did, in fact, have decoded the Gospels. I have no explanation as to exactly why the information didn't come out, but I can show you a number of works of literature that seem to have this information, and I just don't think they knew exactly what to do with it and how to make it public. And of course, the church, if someone did try to have a overt, decoding of the Gospels, it would have been just a death sentence. It wouldn't have, but it wouldn't surprise me if there had been a number of efforts like this.
Well, I know that there have been efforts to try to allude to it, but the thing is that people, once they knew this information, would look back after the fact and say, this is what they've been trying to tell us. I think that the people the mystics of Safad, who wrote the prayer poetry, were putting some of that information in their prayer poetry.
Sure.
And it wasn't actually until someone like you could figure out what was going on that people would be able to find out and say, oh, this mystic knew.
Right. That's right.
And that they were lampooning the royals.
Right. And that's why they were mystics, in quote, is that they were putting their language in a very symbolic level, just because that was all that was available to them. It is really going to be curious to see how much of the existing sort of understanding of literature holds up. I hate to say this, but in fact, there have been a lot of people who knew the truth about the Gospels throughout history. I wasn't the first one to.
And they were all
them.
Screaming from the grave, and I think
they tried. As I see it, my interpretation of history is simply that those that were overt or clear enough so they could be understood, that those efforts were destroyed by the church and the state, which was using the church as its basis for existence of the divine right of kings, are simply very symbolic and now can be decoded. Which is why the Shakespearean literature is so interesting in that it's such a well-formed body of literature regarding the understanding of the Gospels from the graves of Jews. Amelia Bassano was a Marano who told history the truth, and she was able to live to actually a ripe old age.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, she did. But she had a troubled life, nevertheless. She's certainly one of history's most interesting characters, and I'm happy that we're able to bring her information to the public. It really is certainly long overdue.
I think that's great. Well, I thank you very much for all this intriguing information. I think this is like you're the Indiana Jones of typology.
I don't know. I just it always comes up. People say, "Well, you don't have the background in any of these fields. Why do you see these things?" And I have no real explanation other than I'm just a very curious reader, and somehow it all made sense to me. And once I saw the beginnings of the system, then I had the energy. I was really wanted to see really what was in back of it. I noticed there were strange parallels between Titus and Jesus. I had no agenda against Christianity. I certainly didn't think it would lead to a new understanding of the Gospels. But
don't you see what Christianity has led to?
I absolutely. Particularly now that I've been able to decode the literature. I was raised a Catholic and fell away from the faith just because of it's just the era when my generation did that. I didn't have any particular reason for falling away, but I really didn't have a clear understanding of history. The anti-Semitism in the Gospels is very subtle. It's very subtle.
Subtle? I don't think it's subtle. I think
no,
it's
in the way I think it's subtle in the way it impacts people. In other words, the story of the Jews killing the beloved God-man, crying out, saying his blood will be on our blood and on our children's blood. The anti-Semitism that the Gospels couldn't work its anti-Semitism as effectively as it has if it was just stupid and overt. They make the reader love the Jesus character.
But they knew
and then they find a way to make the Jews' killing of Jesus reflect upon them, not the Romans.
But they knew that the Jews weren't going to buy the story.
Sure. Well, the Zealots. What the purpose of the Gospels is the same as the Arch of Titus.
It's a monument.
It's a vanity piece. It's just a way of notifying history that we were that clever and that we defeated them. And it's more than just that. The battle was fought over who was God. The Caesars were divine. They had made themselves God. It was part of their political power. And the God that the Jews worshipped was a threat to their political power. And so they warped the Jewish scripture into showing that, in fact, it was looking to Caesar, because that was what they wanted to do with the gospel. So as far as a conversion tool, I think it's absolutely not the case that the gospel was read to Messianic zealots in the first century. No, they didn't do that. If you look at the catacombs, which of course were started by the Flavians, oddly, and all of the first saints are of course the Christian Flavians, who are all related to or employees of the Flavian family. That was where that's where the religion would have been in the imperial cult in Rome. So no, they certainly weren't using the Gospels to try to convert zealots. They would have laughed at them and tried to kill the individual who was blaspheming their scripture.
So why do people think that Christianity is an offshoot of Judaism? That baffles me.
It is amazing. It's simply because the character claims to be Jewish, and he cites Jewish scripture. There is absolutely nothing in the origin of Judaism that suggests a Jewish origin. People have this bizarre fantasies trying to explain how a mystery cult morphed with Judaism and out popped Christianity, or a Markian community suddenly had a new idea about the scripture, or Paul, for example. How this individual had his epiphany and then sort of saw a kind of Judaism that could abide with the Roman Empire. This is all just ludicrous. It's as I said, there was really only there's only one delineation in Judaism, and that was if you were for the empire, abide with the empire, or you didn't. If you didn't, you would probably be looking at the Messianic scriptures in the way the individual who wrote the Habakkuk Pesher, the Dead Sea Scroll, did, that he's looking to someone who has divine power. And that person doesn't want the Romans around. He wants to have reestablish the Jewish state that the Maccabees created. On the other hand, the Herods and the Alexanders, they're just fine with pro-Roman Judaism, which is what Christianity is. So
it is.
Yeah,
it's definitely.
It's not real. It is not an offshoot of Judaism. What it is. It's another form of the imperial cult. That's really what Christianity is.
Okay. Well, you know, John Hudson had described the structure of the Gospels, and it explains that what they were trying to do is create a substitute or a satirical version of the Torah, and then they turned it into a piece of Roman literature and then a piece of Greek literature, and they were trying to encompass everybody. So
they were making a piece of literature that they wanted to represent their divinity. So they, you know, you can see reflections of Homer and Julius Caesar and other characters pop up in the Gospels, and a lot of scholars have seen this and noted that there's these strange links to Roman and Greek traditions in the Gospels, and you know, why in the world are they there? They certainly aren't in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
That's true.
But you know, it's because this is where the literature originates.
Well, I thank you very much for coming by again.
My pleasure.
And I want to encourage Jewish scholars to look into this, and I thank everybody for tuning in to Rodeph Emet.